Assalamualaikum.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Nana Firman. I'm a doctorate student at CTS.
Today we'll explore how racism is woven into the fabric of history, society, religion, and the environment. This session is developed from scholarly insights, lived experiences, and case studies to deepen our understanding and strengthen our commitment to justice. Together, we reflect on how faith and ethical responsibility call us to connect and respond with awareness to pursue meaningful transformation. Before we dive into the historical roots of racism, I want to ground us in the present. Racism is not a thing of the past. In fact, it didn't vanish with civil rights legislation or the abolition of slavery. It has evolved through mass incarceration, police violence, voter suppression, economic exclusion, and cultural erasure. What you're about to hear and see is taken from a recent podcast in social media, which reminds us that racism is still alive. It speaks from pain, memory, and resistance. Listen and watch closely with the courage to confront what you hear and what you read.
Just a chronic lack of development, lack of contributions to mankind. No inventions, no philosophers, no true great masterpiece. If half of Africa was super developed or halfway developed and the other half wasn't, maybe you'd have an argument whether they got colonized or not. Whether they got freed from slavery in 1800 or in 1860. It's the same story everywhere. There's not one written language among them. They don't have books. They don't have words. And there's billions of black people. They do have that lower level of development, and I think that's why they underperform.
Racism is not just about personal bias or hatred. It is a system of advantage based on race. Racism functions like a moving walkway at the airport. Even those who are not actively hateful may still benefit from and perpetuate systemic racism if they remain passive. To resist it, we must actively step off that walkway. There are two key levels to understand racism. The first one is individual racism, like personal attitudes, behaviors, or actions rooted in racial prejudice. The second one is structural or systemic racism, which includes institutional policies and practices that produce and reinforce racial inequality, often without overtly racist intent. This system operates across housing, education, healthcare, policing, employment, and media, shaping life outcomes based on race. So, in short, racism is not a glitch in the system, it is the system. The American story cannot be told without slavery. For over 250 years, black bodies were commodified, brutalized, and legally defined as property. This system of racial capitalism shaped the nation's economy, laws, and cultural consciousness. Even after slavery's formal abolition in 1865, white supremacy was reconstituted through new structures: black codes, convict listing, lynching, and Jim Crow segregation. These systems police Black mobility, economic independence, and civic participation under the disguise of separate but equal. The ideology of Black inferiority was never dismantled. It simply adapted. The transition from slavery to segregation was not a rupture, but a rebranding of control. Racism is not an individual vice, it is a structural inheritance. It was engineered to justify colonial expansion, slavery, and economic exploitation. This is the foundation of what is called racial capitalism, which is a system where race and class intertwine to extract labor and deny rights. In the United States, racism was inscribed in the Constitution, woven into land ownership, codified in redlining, and embedded in policing. It defines who is protected, who is surveilled, and who is punished. We should be reminded that to believe racism has disappeared is to misunderstand its genius. It changes and survives. It has evolved through housing policy, school funding, incarceration, and environmental injustices.
Structural racism shows up in many interconnected systems, such as in schools, housings, or law enforcement, shaping unequal outcomes that disproportionately harming communities of color. But structural racism also adapts over time, targeting different groups in different ways, especially during moments of national anxiety or crisis. A clear example of this is anti-Asian racism. So let's take a closer look on how this form of racism operates historically and today.
Anti-Asian racism in the United States has deep historical roots, shaped by exclusionary laws, xenophobic fears, and perpetual foreign stereotypes. Asians were cast as foreign, unassimilable, and a threat to white labor. From the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to Japanese American incarceration during World War II, Asian communities have long been treated as threats to the nation and never fully belonging. Most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic sparked a rise in anti-Asian violence, fueled by radicalized blame and misinformation. These attacks are not isolated incidents. They reflect a long pattern of scapegoating Asian bodies in times of national crisis. It's important to recognize the diversity within Asian American communities and how racism can be both hyper-visible through violence and slurs and also invisible through erasure, tokenization, and also by model minority myth, which is a stereotype used to pit Asian communities against Black and Indigenous peoples. This narrative erases diversity, downplays racism, and undermines solidarity. Anti-Asian racism is not simply about hate, it's about exclusion, exploitation, and strategic division. Therefore, addressing anti-Asian racism requires solidarity across communities and a deeper understanding of how racial hierarchies divide and harms us all.
As we have seen, racism is not limited to one group or one historical moment. Whether through laws, stereotypes, or violence, racial injustice affects diverse communities, often in ways that overlap and intersect. But how do our spiritual traditions call us to respond? Let's now turn to the theological perspective in Islam, which offers both a moral vision and a prophetic example of anti-racism. So Islam teaches the equality of all human beings and calls Muslims to resist injustice not only in words, but through action rooted in faith. In his final sermon, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, declared in his last sermon that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab, nor for a non-Arab over an Arab, and no white person to a black, nor for a black person over a white, except in piety and good action. So his sermon reminds us that Islamic anti-racism is not only theological, but also practical. From early Muslims like Bilal ibn Rabah, an Abyssinian and former enslaved man, raised to a position of honor, to this modern teaching that challenge nationalisms and ethnocentrism, Islam contains resources for confronting racism at both the individual level as well as the structural level. It affirms the essential equality for all people, regardless of race or ethnicity, as stated in the Holy Quran, that human diversity is a sign of God's creation, not a cause for superiority.
يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا.
And the Quranic verse continues with, "The most noble among you is the most righteous." Therefore, in Islam, racism is not just a social injustice. It is considered a spiritual disease and a violation of divine order. In fact, Islamic universal vision transcends tribalism, nationalism, and racial superiority. Islam demands anti-racism, not just tolerance. Prejudice rooted in lineage, color, or ethnicity is a form of arrogance or kibr, the very sin of the devil who refused to bow to Adam out of a sense of racial superiority. So Islamic ethic compels Muslims to recognize the divine dignity of all human beings and dismantle unjust hierarchies. Also, to stand in solidarity with the oppressed. So, true anti racism in Islam involves more than colorblindness. It requires an active commitment to justice, humility, and the upliftment of the oppressed. Anti racism is not an optional in Islam. It is considered a fardu ain, which is an individual moral responsibility. Now we'll turn to the third resurrection, which is a phase where Black American Muslims affirm their faith without erasing their culture, challenging Arab centered norms and advocating for an Islam rooted in Black identity and experience. Black American Muslims hold a unique place in the United States religious history. As descendants of enslaved Africans, many of whom were Muslims, and as leaders in the 20th century Islamic revival through movements like the Nation of Islam, they represent a homegrown American Islam that predates large-scale Muslim immigration. Black American Muslims are often marginalized within broader American society for being Black and Muslim, and within Muslim communities for being Black and indigenous to America. Still, Black American Islam is not a transitional phase nor a cultural adaptation. It is a legitimate expression of Islamic tradition rooted in the Black struggle for dignity, justice, and spiritual sovereignty. This identity resists erasure from both white supremacy and immigrant centric Muslim narratives. For many Black Americans, Islam offered a path to reclaim spiritual authority, dignity, and community identity, despite the effects of racism and Christian racialization. The Nation of Islam and later Sunni movements position Islam as a form of resistant theology. But this has also produced tensions. Some Black Americans view Islam as foreign, disconnected from the Black church. Others saw it as a liberating alternative to Christian traditions tied to slavery or assimilation. Islam was not just a faith, it was a way to reject white supremacy and affirm Black personhood. This dynamic must be understood on its own term, not reduced to assimilation or reaction. On the other hand, within immigrant majority Muslim communities, Black American Muslims have frequently faced exclusion and cultural marginalization. Despite being foundational to Islam in the United States, they are sometimes treated as outsiders. In fact, there's a strong critique on the immigrant authority complex, where legitimacy is defined by Arab or South Asian heritage, language, and norms. This hierarchy delegitimizes Black American scholarship and leadership and treats African American Islam as a stepping stone rather than a destination, while silences conversation about race, power, and anti Blackness in Muslim spaces. Hence, a call for a third resurrection, which is a movement in which Black American Muslims reclaim narrative control and theological leadership in their own terms. The third resurrection marks a powerful shift in the identity and vision of Black American Muslims. Unlike earlier phases that centered either Black nationalism or assimilation into immigrant divine Islam, this phase is about reclamation and self definition. Black American Muslims now assert an Islam that honors both their religious and cultural heritage. This means rejecting the pressure to conform to Arab centric or immigrant norms that often dominate American Muslim spaces. Instead, the Third Resurrection embraces an Islam that is authentically Black, deeply rooted in local history, community needs, and lived experience. It is not a retreat into isolation, but a call for dignity, leadership, and theological depth, an Islam that speaks directly to the struggles and resilience of Black America while remaining connected to the broader Ummah. Let us also look at the issue of racism in the continent of Africa, where colonial legacies, colorism, and social hierarchies continue to shape lives in deeply unequal ways. One of the most courageous voices in this struggle was Jamila Debekiski, Tunisia's first Black woman elected to parliament. Her presence in national politics was groundbreaking, but her mission extended far beyond representation. She challenged both the state and society to recognize and dismantle anti Black racism, a reality often denied and dismissed in North African discourse. She highlighted the structural and cultural roots of racism in Tunisia, from discriminatory media portrayals to barrier in education, housing, and employment. She also called out silence within Arab and Muslim communities, reminding us that racism is not just a Western problem, it exists within Muslim majority societies as well. Grounded in both her Black identity and Islamic faith, her advocacy demanded justice, visibility, and dignity for Black Tunisian and Sub Saharan migrants alike. Her work continues to inspire those fighting for racial equity in regions where that conversation is still emerging. Now let us look at structural racism, which is referring to the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, and law. Today, we'll focus on how this operates in the realm of health, a space where injustice often hides in plain sight. Health disparities don't just arise from genetic or personal choices. They are rooted in policies, environments, and economic systems that consistently advantage white communities while putting communities of color, especially black and indigenous population, at greater risk. For example, Black Americans face higher rates of maternity mortality, asthma, diabetes, and now COVID 19 deaths, not because of inherent vulnerability, but because of the lack of access to quality care, to exposure to environmental toxin, to the chronic stress of discrimination. Racism is a health determinant. Structural racism in health is not one bad doctor or one denied appointment, but about pattern inequality, where policies, institutions, and histories coverage to shape who gets sick, who suffers, and who survives. Addressing this requires more than diversity training or charity. It demands a structural response to a structural problem. Another realm of structural racism is environmental racism. Before we look at specific examples, let's first understand what we mean by environmental racism. Environmental racism refers to the ways in which environmental hazards like toxic waste sites, polluted air, contaminated water, and industrial facilities are disproportionately placed around or near communities of color, like Black, Indigenous, and low income communities. It is not accidental. These patterns are shaped by historical policies like redlining, land disposition, and weak enforcement of environmental protection in marginalized areas. These communities often lack political power or economic resources to resist harmful development or demand cleanup. Environmental racism shows us that the fight for clean air, water, and land is not just ecological, it is racial and social. The right to a safe and healthy environment is deeply tied to justice. Now let's take a look at how this plays out through the struggle at Standing Rock, a powerful example of indigenous resistance. In 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe led a historic movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which threatened their water source and sacred lands. The pipeline was originally rerouted away from a largely white town after safety concerns, yet was pushed through tribal lands without full consent. This decision reflects a pattern of communities of color, especially indigenous communities, are often placed on the front lines of environmental harm. What unfolded as Standing Rock was not just a protest, it was a prayerful resistance led by indigenous youths and elders. The movement brought together thousands of people in solidarity, creating a space of ceremony, resilience, and international attention. This case reminds us that environmental justice must include native sovereignty, land rights, and the spiritual significance of protecting the earth. Another example of environmental racism is found in Southwest Philadelphia, a largely black neighborhood that for decades was home to the largest and oldest oil refinery in the East Coast. The residents live with constant exposure to toxic emissions, flares, and chemical leaks from the Philadelphia Energy Solution refinery. Many suffered from asthma, cancer, and other chronic illnesses, but their concerns were ignored or minimized for years. This refinery was not placed by accident. It sat in a community with limited political power, a legacy of redlining, and racial segregation that made it easier to site polluting industries near black families. When a massive explosion occurred in 2019, it was a wake up call. But the damage had already been done. Environmental racism here meant that black residents paid the price of pollution while wealthier, whiter neighborhoods remained protected. This case shows how structural racism plays out through environmental neglect and how justice must include clean air, safe housing, and community health for all. The refinery explosion in Black Philadelphia is just one example of how environmental harm becomes catastrophic when combined with systemic neglect. Now, let's take a broader look at how disasters, both natural and industrial, interact with racism, shaping who is most vulnerable, who gets protected, and who gets left behind. In reality, disasters don't affect all communities equally, and neither do disaster responses. Systemic racism often determines who gets help, how fast, and how thoroughly. In Black and low income communities, emergency responses are frequently slower, less coordinated, and under resourced. During Hurricane Katrina in 2005, for example, predominantly black neighborhoods were left stranded for days, while wealthier, whiter areas received faster evacuations and relief. These disparities are not isolated. They reflect deeper structural inequities in planning, infrastructure, and political priority. Disasters expose the cracks already present in society and even widen them for the most vulnerable. In many cases, environmental injustice is intensified during and after disasters. Communities of color are most likely to live near hazardous industrial zones due to decades of discriminatory zoning and housing policies. When disasters or environmental failures occur, these communities face elevated risk of toxic exposure from spills, contamination, and neglected infrastructures. After Hurricane Katrina, for example, mold and toxic dust overtook public housing units in New Orleans, leading to long term respiratory illnesses, especially to children and elderly. Another striking example is the case known as the Nightmare on Eno Road in Dixon, Tennessee, where a black family's well water was contaminated by industrial toxins. For years, local and federal officials denied the extent of the contamination, despite evidence of cancer and other health impacts. White neighbors received city water hookups while the black family remained exposed to poisoned water. These cases reveal how racism determines not just environmental risk, but also who suffers the longest after disaster strikes and the value placed on whose health and safety matter. Even after the storm passes, the recovery process often deepens racial inequity. Disaster aid programs tend to favor property owners and well documented communities, leaving behind renters, undocumented families, and historically disinvested neighborhoods. Funding flows more easily to affluent areas, while Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities face bureaucratic delays, denial of claims, and displacement. After Katrina, many Black residents were unable to return due to a lack of affordable housing and an uneven rebuilding support. Meanwhile, developers and investors moved in, accelerating gentrification and cultural erasure. Equitable recovery means more than rebuilding what was lost. It requires reimagining systems that prioritize the needs, voices, and rights of the most impacted. Within these layered disasters, it is often Black women who lead the healing, resistance, and rebuilding, connecting environmental justice to spiritual and communal survival through what is known as eco-womanism. Eco-womanism is a spiritual and ethical framework that centers the experiences, knowledge, and struggles of Black women in the fight for environmental justice. This perspective challenges mainstream environmentalism, which often overlooks how environmental degradation is linked to racism, sexism, poverty, and colonialism, which are systems that disproportionately harm Black women and their communities. Eco-womanism affirms that caring for the earth is not separate from caring for people. It draws on ancestral wisdoms, spirituality, and lived experience to resist extractive economies, toxic environments, and environmental neglects. From protesting water contamination in Flint to leading community farming, Black women have long stood at the forefront of ecological justice, often without recognition. Hence, eco-womanism calls us to listen to these voices, honor their leadership, and understand that the Earth's liberation is bound up with the liberation of the most oppressed.
As we have explored today, racism is not just a matter of individual prejudice. It is embedded in systems, institutions, and histories. But awareness alone is not enough. The question we must ask now is, what can we do? Firstly, we can reflect on history and systems of power, understanding how oppression has been built and maintained over time. Truth-telling is the foundation of justice. Secondly, we must listen deeply to marginalized voices, not to speak for others, but to learn, stand beside them, and follow the leadership of those most impacted by injustices. Thirdly, action is essential, whether through policy, advocacy, protests, spiritual discipline, or community solidarity. We are called to resist racism, whether it shows up in public life or within ourselves. And finally, we must center justice in all areas of life, in faith, environment, education, and law, recognizing that the struggle for racial justice is inseparable for the struggle for human dignity. This is a moral, spiritual, and collective journey, and each of us has a role to play.